AITA for keeping my grandmother's heirloom away from my sister-in-law because I'm blood. When I look at my grandmother's locket, a warmth washes over me that I can hardly put into words. It's small and unassuming, a little vintage heart with delicate engravings worn by time and love. The tiny hinges squeak a bit when it opens, revealing space for 2 miniature pictures, which are faded now, nearly unrecognizable. The locket is delicate, but the memories it holds feel anything but fragile. My grandmother would often tell me stories of the women in our family who wore it before her, stories of resilience, family bonds, and quiet strength that somehow were captured in that small, golden heart. It was as though the locket held a piece of each of them, like a capsule of our family's soul. My grandmother gave me this locket just before she passed. She told me, with a frail smile, that it was a piece of her she wanted me to hold on to. She asked that I cherish it, wear it, and someday pass it down, carrying our family's memories forward into new generations. It was a moment that felt heavy with meaning. In that instant, the locket felt like more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything she stood for and all the values she'd worked so hard to instill in me. Growing up, I was incredibly close to my grandmother. She had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the world when we were together, sharing stories and teaching me old family recipes in her cozy kitchen. Even when the world felt chaotic, her presence and her love made things simple. When she told me stories about the locket, it wasn't just family history, it was like receiving little fragments of strength and guidance. With each story, she was teaching me about our family's legacy and the importance of preserving it. So when she passed, I knew exactly what I had to do. Her wish was now my responsibility. She trusted me to carry forward this legacy. And as painful as it was to lose her, the locket became a small piece of her that I could keep with me. It was a part of her spirit that I would always have near my heart. And while it couldn't replace her, it was a reminder of everything she'd taught me about family and the strength we carry within us. The locket itself isn't particularly flashy or even valuable in a monetary sense. But to me, it's priceless. I never imagined that something so simple could become such a vital part of my identity, grounding me even in my moments of uncertainty. It's funny how a little piece of metal can carry so much weight. But this locket has always felt like a talisman, connecting me not just to my grandmother but to the generations of women who came before me. In the months after my grandmother's passing, I wore the locket almost daily, finding comfort in its familiar weight around my neck. To me, it's not just jewelry, it's a symbol of resilience, love, and the enduring strength that my grandmother embodied. I see it as a reminder to stay true to myself and honor her legacy. Even as life continues to change, the locket is now mine. Yes, but it's also my responsibility to uphold its legacy. That's what she wanted for me, and I intended to keep that promise. I didn't think twice about it until recently, when my cousin Mark's wife, Tina, made her claim on the locket. Everything changed. The locket and I became inseparable, especially in the months following my grandmother's passing. It was comforting, a daily reminder that her spirit was still with me. I assumed everyone in the family respected the significance of it as much as I did. Then, out of nowhere, came Tina's bold and unexpected claim. It happened during a family get-together. One of those casual afternoons where everyone is relaxed and catching up. Mark's wife, Tina, pulled me aside in the kitchen. Her tone was friendly, but there was something almost rehearsed in her voice, like she'd been planning this conversation. "I've been meaning to talk to you about the locket," she started, smiling in that way she does when she's about to make a request she knows might not go over well. I felt my heart skip a beat. "The locket? I thought everyone understood what it meant to me." Tina went on, "Since I'm part of the family now, I think it would be really special if the locket stayed within Mark's side of the family. You know, since you're likely to marry and take it somewhere else." I was speechless, caught off guard by her assumption. She sounded so casual, as if the locket were just another piece of jewelry, something that could easily change hands with a simple request. I tried to remind myself that maybe she didn't fully grasp the locket's meaning. That maybe she didn't understand the deep connection I had with it. "Tina, my grandmother gave this locket specifically to me, and it's always been passed down from one woman to another within the family. She entrusted me with it. To keep it safe and pass it down. I managed to say, hoping she would understand my connection to it. But Tina didn't back down. I understand that it's meaningful to you, she replied. But think of what it would mean for me. Being married into the family. I could honor it and keep it here for future generations. You know, family should come before individual preferences. Her words stung. She framed it as if I were being selfish. As if wanting to keep a deeply personal family heirloom was somehow trivial. There was an insinuation that my connection to it was lesser, even dismissible, simply because I might one day marry outside the family. I could feel frustration bubbling up, but I knew reacting with anger wouldn't help. I took a deep breath and reminded her, again, that the locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a part of my grandmother's legacy that she had chosen to leave with me. But Tina only grew more insistent, pressing her point as if she were simply waiting for me to cave under her reasoning. By the time she left, I felt a gnawing mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't just a difference of opinion, it felt like a misunderstanding of my connection to my grandmother and everything she had taught me. The fact that Tina could view the locket as something to be kept within the family felt dismissive of the deep personal meaning I attached to it. It wasn't about keeping it for myself, it was about honoring a promise. As if the locket were nothing but a family trinket. She went to Mark and some of my cousins, painting my refusal as a selfish act. According to her, I was undermining her role as Mark's wife and not respecting her as part of our family. To Tina, this was an issue of who deserved the locket, a material possession, while to me, it was about loyalty and legacy. The days after my conversation with Tina were uncomfortable. I could feel the tension building, even in small family interactions. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Tina's dissatisfaction would spread through our family. I'd hoped that maybe she would let the matter go, that she'd come to understand why my grandmother's locket was so significant to me. But Tina was relentless, and it wasn't long before Mark and some of my cousins started to weigh in on the situation. The first sign came at a Sunday brunch. We were all sitting around, talking about the usual family things, when Mark casually brought up the locket, his voice carrying just a hint of defensiveness. He didn't directly say that he thought I should give it to Tina, but he made comments that hinted at the idea, emphasizing the importance of keeping family heirlooms in the household. It was subtle, but I knew exactly what he was doing. I tried to brush it off, hoping the conversation would die down if I didn't engage. But then one of my cousins, who rarely got involved in family matters, chimed in. I mean, she is family now. Maybe it's not a big deal who has the locket as long as it stays in the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The locket wasn't just an object to me, it was my connection to my grandmother. Something deeply personal that she had entrusted to me. I glanced around the table, half hoping that someone would back me up. But everyone seemed either uncomfortable or indifferent. My heart sank as I realized that some of them really did see the locket as a mere family artifact. Something to be passed around based on who happened to be closest at the time. Then came the most surprising reaction of all, my mom. I'd thought she, of all people, would understand my attachment to the locket. But when I tried to explain myself later that day, she took a more diplomatic stance than I'd expected. Honey, she said gently, I know you feel strongly about the locket. And I understand why, but sometimes, it's easier to let things go than to create friction within the family. Tina's trying to find her place, and this could be a way for her to feel included. I stared at her, stunned. This was the same woman who had encouraged me to honor my grandmother's memory, who had shared countless stories about the strong, independent women in our family. And now, she was asking me to compromise on something so meaningful to me, just for the sake of keeping the peace? It felt like a betrayal, though I knew she didn't intend it that way. The idea of giving a nod at me, if I handed over the locket to Tina, it wouldn't feel like a gesture of kindness or inclusion, it would feel like giving up a piece of my grandmother and the promises I'd made to her. I had loved and respected my grandmother more than anyone else in the world. And keeping the locket was a way of preserving that bond. But with Mark pressuring me, my cousins showing indifference, and my own mother suggesting compromise, I began to feel isolated. It was as if everyone around me had decided that my attachment to the locket was trivial. That I was making a fuss over something that should be easily shared. They didn't see how personal this was to me. How much of my identity was wrapped up in honoring my grandmother's legacy. The pressure was intense, and I could feel myself doubting my stance. Was I being unreasonable? Was I so wrapped up in my attachment that I was losing sight of what family truly meant? But every time I tried to convince myself to give in, I'd remember my grandmother's smile when she handed me the locket. Her words about cherishing it and passing it down with love and intention. I was torn between upholding my bond with my grandmother and keeping peace with the living family around me. The more they pushed, the more determined I felt to hold on to it, to stand my ground. But as the family's disapproval grew, so did my sense of guilt and isolation, leaving me wondering if keeping the locket was worth the price I was beginning to pay. The family pressure continued, and with each passing day, I felt the weight of their opinions closing in on me. Every gathering became tense, each conversation colored by the unspoken conflict over the locket. The once happy family meals and gatherings started to feel strained, like everyone was tiptoeing around me or, worse, treating me like an outsider. I'd never felt so alone in a room full of people who were supposed to know and understand me. Then, one evening, Mark called, asking if we could meet up to talk things over, without the rest of the family. I agreed, hoping this conversation might help clear the air. When I arrived at the small coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet, I found him already seated, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. Mark wasted no time getting to the point. He admitted that he'd been under a lot of pressure from Tina and, surprisingly, from some of our other family members as well. Apparently, Tina had been spreading the idea that I didn't respect her place in the family. That I viewed her as less than blood, and that she felt alienated because of it. My frustration grew with every word he said. I'd never done anything to make her feel unwelcome. Yet she was turning this whole situation into a battle about status within the family. Then Mark made a request that shocked me. He said, "I know you're attached to the locket. And I respect that. But Tina's been so upset over this. And it's affecting our relationship. She feels like having the locket would make her feel more accepted. Like she's part of the legacy. Would you consider letting her borrow it for a little while? Just so she can feel more connected to the family?" I was stunned. Borrow it? My mind raced, grappling with the implications of his suggestion. This locket wasn't a toy or a fashion statement. It was an irreplaceable part of our family's history and a deeply personal symbol of my bond with my grandmother. How could he possibly expect me to just hand it over as if it were a simple loan? And for what? To satisfy Tina's insecurities about her role in the family? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. Mark, I started slowly. This locket was given to me by Grandma. It's not just a piece of jewelry, it's part of her memory. Part of the legacy she entrusted to me. Loaning it out to anyone, even for a little while, feels like I'd be betraying that trust. I understand Tina wants to feel connected to the family. But this isn't the way to do it. Mark's face fell. He looked disappointed, but I could tell he wasn't entirely unsympathetic. Yet he pressed on, saying that Tina believed I was making this decision based solely on the fact that she wasn't a blood relative. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Tina had twisted this entire situation into a narrative about belonging. As though I was trying to deny her place in the family. I tried to explain again, my voice steady, that this wasn't about her not being blood. It was about the connection I had with my grandmother and the promise I'd made to her. As the conversation wore on, I could see the toll this conflict was taking on Mark. He was genuinely torn between his loyalty to his wife and his understanding of my perspective. Eventually, he sighed and leaned back, running a hand over his face. "Look," he said quietly, "I don't want to keep pushing this. I don't even know if I fully understand why this means so much to her. But I also don't want her to feel like an outsider in our family. Maybe you're right. Maybe this isn't the way for her to feel connected. But she's really hurt." I nodded, a small sense of relief washing over me. It felt like, for the first time, someone was beginning to see things from my side. Even if only a little. "I get that, Mark," I said, "and I'm not trying to push her away. I want her to feel welcome. I really do. but not at the expense of something that's so deeply important to me. He nodded slowly, looking thoughtful. For the first time since this whole mess had started, I felt like someone in my family might actually be on my side. Or at least understand my stance. We sat in silence for a few moments, both lost in our own thoughts, before he finally spoke up again. "I'll talk to her," he said quietly. "I can't promise she'll understand, but maybe if she hears it from me, it'll help." With that, we parted ways. As I walked back to my car, a new wave of emotions hit me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel entirely alone. And though I knew this was far from over, I couldn't help but feel a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Mark's support would help shift the family dynamic. Mark's support, as small as it was, felt like a bit of validation, a rare spot of understanding in a sea of judgment. I hoped that our conversation would help diffuse the tension, or at least open Tina's eyes to why the locket mattered to me. But, unfortunately, things only got worse. A couple of days after our meeting, I got a text from my mom asking me to stop by her house. I knew from her wording that this wasn't just a friendly invitation. Sure enough, the moment I arrived, she sat me down, looking stern and tired. Without much preamble, she brought up the locket. "Tina feels like you're keeping her at arm's length," she said. "You know, family is about sharing, about coming together, not keeping things to ourselves." I stared at her, trying to keep my composure. "Mom, it's not about keeping things to myself," I replied, my voice as even as I could manage. "It's about honoring Grandma's wishes. This locket was given to me to cherish. And that's exactly what I'm doing. Why is it so hard for everyone to understand that?" She sighed, shaking her head as if I were missing the obvious. "Sweetheart, I think you're being a bit possessive here. Tina is family now too. You need to make room for her. Can't you see how much this is hurting her?" In that moment, I felt a sharp stab of betrayal. My mother, of all people, should have understood the importance of family legacy. She'd heard all the same stories from Grandma, knew just as well as I did what that locket meant. And yet, here she was, asking me to bend over backward for Tina, a person who had come into our family barely 3 years ago. I don't understand why my decision to honor Grandma's memory is being seen as possessive, I said, my voice wavering. This isn't about not liking Tina or not welcoming her. It's about the fact that this locket was meant for me. Grandma wanted me to have it. Why is that not enough for everyone? But my mother didn't seem moved. Instead, she looked at me with disappointment. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "We don't pick and choose who belongs in the family. We all support each other. You need to consider the bigger picture here." The bigger picture. That phrase stuck with me long after I left her house, eating away at me as I drove home. What was the bigger picture? Did it mean that my wants, my feelings, and my memories of Grandma should take a backseat for the sake of someone else's comfort? Someone who, quite frankly, was trying to claim something that had never belonged to her? A few days later, I found myself at yet another family gathering. I almost dreaded these events now, knowing they'd likely be riddled with side glances and hushed whispers. Sure enough, as soon as I walked in, I could feel the atmosphere shift. Everyone's eyes flickering toward me and then away. And Tina, of course, was right in the middle of it all, laughing with my cousins and their spouses as if everything was perfect. As I tried to relax, pretending I didn't notice the tension, I overheard a few fragments of conversation between my aunts. "It's a bit selfish, don't you think?" one of them murmured, clearly aware that I was within earshot. "I mean, it's just a piece of jewelry. Why keep it to yourself if it could mean so much to someone else?" I clenched my fists, anger bubbling up inside me. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol, a piece of my grandmother's life and legacy, handed down to me because she believed I'd honor it. Why was it suddenly selfish to want to respect that? Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I turned to face them, my voice steady but firm. "I know everyone seems to think that I'm being selfish, but this locket wasn't just some random piece of jewelry. It was a part of Grandma's life, a part of her history, and she entrusted it to me. It's not about excluding anyone, it's about respecting her memory and the promise I made to her." A silence fell over the group as my words sank in. My aunts looked away, clearly uncomfortable, and I felt a small pang of guilt for calling them out. But it had to be said. I was done being treated like the villain in my own family for wanting to hold on to something so deeply meaningful. Yet, as I walked away, I noticed Tina's gaze lingering on me, her expression unreadable. For the rest of the evening, she kept her distance, but I could feel her watching me, as if she were calculating her next move. And sure enough, before the night was over, she made her way over to me, her smile forced but polite. "I didn't mean to cause a rift in the family. You know," she said, her tone deceptively sweet. "I just thought that the locket would be a nice way for me to feel more connected. It's not like I was asking you to give it up forever." I looked at her, struggling to keep my frustration in check. "Tina, this isn't about excluding you. It's about honoring the memory of someone I loved. I'm sorry if that's hard to understand. But I'm not going to change my mind." She gave a small, dismissive shrug, as though I were overreacting. "Well, I guess everyone has their own way of showing respect. I just hope this doesn't cause more problems down the line." With that, she walked away, leaving me seething. Her words, though seemingly innocent, carried an edge that unsettled me. It felt like a veiled threat, a warning that this wasn't over. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the pressure from my family was only going to get worse. Back at home that night, I sat alone in my room, clutching the locket in my hand. My mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions: frustration, anger, sadness, and a deep, aching loneliness. It felt like the one person who would have understood, my grandmother, was gone, leaving me to defend her memory in a family that seemed all too willing to overlook her wishes for the sake of keeping the peace. But as I held the locket, feeling the cool metal against my palm, I made a silent vow. No matter what, I would not let them take this away from me. This was my piece of Grandma's legacy, and I'd hold onto it as fiercely as she would have wanted me to. Despite my resolute words to myself that night, the days that followed were harder than I expected. The silent treatment I received from family members didn't let up, and even my own parents kept reminding me to consider the family dynamic. It was isolating and exhausting, with every interaction leaving me feeling like an outsider. Yet, I held my ground. As the days turned into weeks, I kept thinking about my grandmother and everything she'd taught me. She'd been a quiet force in our family, never the type to raise her voice or impose her views on others. But her presence was always commanding. She'd built a life based on values, on loyalty, and on never letting others shake her sense of self. I could practically hear her voice reminding me to stay firm, to respect the things that truly mattered. One afternoon, I sat down with the locket in my hand, tracing the intricate designs on its surface. Memories flooded back, summer afternoons baking in her kitchen, her hands flour-dusted and steady as she passed on family recipes, her voice as she told me about our family's history, sharing stories of resilience and love. I knew then, more clearly than ever, that my fight to keep the locket wasn't about material possession or a need to control family heirlooms. It was about loyalty to her, to the trust she'd placed in me. That night, Tina called. I hadn't heard directly from her since that evening at the family gathering. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Hi," she began, her voice slightly hesitant. "I just wanted to talk. You know, without all the family around." I stayed silent, letting her continue. "I don't want you to feel attacked or like I'm trying to take something away from you," she said, her tone soft but with an edge I couldn't ignore. "I just thought, I'm part of this family too now. Don't you think it's fair for me to have something that connects me to Grandma's legacy?" Hearing her bring up my grandmother felt jarring, like the line had been crossed. "Tina, I understand that you want to feel connected to the family," I replied, struggling to keep my voice even. "But this locket isn't just some object to pass around. It's something deeply personal to me. Something Grandma entrusted me with." She sighed, and I could almost picture her shaking her head in frustration. "You're making this a lot more complicated than it needs to be," she said. "I just thought, since I'm married into the family, I'd get a little more consideration." The way she said it, as if her marriage to my cousin somehow meant she should have access to things that had nothing to do with her, struck a nerve. But I didn't want to argue. I'd explained my stance, and I wasn't about to justify it further. Look, I said, taking a deep breath, this isn't something I can compromise on. Grandma wanted me to have it, and I'm going to honor that. If you want to feel connected to her, there are other ways, stories, memories, even other keepsakes. But this locket stays with me. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought she might finally understand. But then, she replied, her voice cold, fine, I just hope you realize how selfish this makes you look. You're isolating yourself from the family over something you could share. With that, she hung up, leaving me staring at the phone, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't about selfishness or exclusion, it was about honoring the memory of someone I loved dearly. But to Tina, and apparently to a few others in the family, my decision to keep the locket had become a symbol of defiance, of choosing my own will over the collective harmony they expected. After that conversation, I made it clear that I was done discussing the locket. Each time the topic was brought up, whether through subtle comments or direct questions, I'd simply state, I've already explained my decision, and move on. It wasn't easy. The disapproval was practically palpable every time I was around my relatives. But I kept my resolve, knowing that no amount of pressure or guilt-tripping would change my stance. A few weeks later, I received a letter from one of my older aunts, someone who had been close to my grandmother as well. She'd always been quiet throughout this whole ordeal, never taking sides or offering unsolicited advice. Her note was brief but filled with warmth, expressing her admiration for the way I'd stood my ground. Grandma would be proud of you, she wrote. Family heirlooms aren't just possessions, they're memories, stories, and responsibilities. It's not wrong to protect that. Reading her words felt like a balm to my bruised heart. I'd spent so long feeling judged and isolated that I'd forgotten there were still people who understood. My aunt's letter reminded me that I wasn't alone in wanting to protect Grandma's legacy. And that validation gave me the strength I needed to keep moving forward. In the end, Tina and I reached a kind of unspoken truce. She no longer pestered me about the locket, and I made an effort to be cordial whenever we were in family settings. It was a tenuous peace, but it was enough. I knew that our relationship would never be the same. There would always be an underlying tension, a sense of distrust, but I had no regrets. By holding on to the locket, I wasn't just protecting a piece of jewelry. I was honoring a bond that went far beyond material things. It was my promise to my grandmother, my way of carrying forward everything she'd taught me. And though it cost me, I knew I'd made the right choice. The strain within the family became more apparent as time passed. Tina's bitterness toward me only intensified, and she found subtle ways to make her feelings known during family gatherings. She'd bring up the topic of family legacy in conversation, weaving in pointed remarks about the importance of sharing heirlooms and how new members of the family deserved to feel included. Each time, her words stung a bit more, like little needles pricking the skin, trying to provoke a response. I'd nod and smile, deflecting as best as I could, refusing to give her the satisfaction of an argument. But the tension between us hung in the air, noticeable to anyone who cared to pay attention. My cousin Mark was caught in the crossfire. While he tried to stay neutral, I could tell he was struggling. It wasn't uncommon to catch him throwing apologetic glances my way, a silent plea for understanding. I sympathized with him. I knew he didn't want to alienate either of us and was torn between loyalty to his wife and his own sense of fairness. But even that understanding didn't make it any easier to bear the pressure. My parents, too, found themselves swept into the fray. They became frequent mediators, encouraging me to consider Tina's perspective. It's just a piece of jewelry, my mom would say gently during our calls. Surely there's a compromise. You could let her borrow it sometimes. It doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing situation. But each time, I would reiterate the same thing. It wasn't about ownership or compromise. It was about respecting Grandma's wishes. That locket wasn't meant for Tina, it was meant for me. And it held my memories. My moments with her. Sharing it, even temporarily, felt like diluting something sacred. Like losing a part of my own connection to my grandmother. My mom would sigh, eventually letting the matter drop. But I could tell she thought I was being unnecessarily stubborn. The only person who didn't try to sway me was my dad. He would sit with me in silence, listening to my thoughts, letting me speak without judgment. One evening, after I'd poured my frustrations out to him over coffee, he reached out and squeezed my hand. "You know, your grandmother would have been proud of you for standing by her wishes," he said softly. "I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Some things are too precious to share." Those words gave me strength when it felt like everything around me was bending under the weight of family expectations. But as supportive as he wasn't able to shield me from the subtle but growing rift within the family. Birthday parties, holiday gatherings, every event felt tinged with a discomfort that hadn't been there before. People spoke in lowered voices when I entered the room, and I noticed the way conversations seemed to falter when I was around. It hurt deeply to feel like I was becoming an outsider in my own family. But I reminded myself why I was doing this, holding onto the locket as though it were my lifeline. Eventually, I found a way to cope with the pressure. I began limiting my time at family events, making quick appearances and leaving early, just enough to show my face but not long enough to endure the inevitable comments and passive-aggressive glances. It was a form of self-preservation, a way to protect myself from the sting of their disapproval. And it worked, at least. Until Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was the holiday we all gathered for without fail. An annual tradition where everyone, from the youngest cousin to the eldest grandparent, filled the house with laughter, food, and warmth. Skipping it wasn't an option. So I braced myself for the ordeal. But nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me that year. As soon as I entered the house, I could sense the tension. Tina's side of the family had arrived earlier and was stationed around the kitchen, helping with preparations. When I walked in, her smile was tight, her eyes narrowed just slightly, as if she'd been waiting for me to arrive. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the warm greetings from my other cousins. But it was impossible to ignore the undercurrent of hostility radiating from her. During dinner, everything came to a head. My uncle, who rarely involved himself in family conflicts, turned to me and asked about the locket, remarking how generous it would be of me to let Tina have a turn with it. It was a casual comment, but I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my response. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my tone even as I explained, yet again, that the locket was a personal item left to me by Grandma, and that I wasn't comfortable sharing it. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. But before I could let it settle, Tina decided it was time to make her feelings known. "You know, it's just a piece of jewelry," she said, her voice saccharine sweet, but her eyes cold. "It's not like it's the crown jewels. Sometimes I think you're just doing this to prove a point." Her words struck a nerve, and I felt a flush of anger rise in my cheeks. But I held it back, refusing to let her bait me. Instead, I repeated myself, my voice firmer this time. "I'm keeping the locket because it was given to me. And because it means something to me that you can't understand. It's not about proving a point. It's about respecting Grandma's wishes." Tina rolled her eyes, letting out a dramatic sigh. "Well, I think we all know what this is really about. You just want to feel special. Like you're the only one with a connection to her. Newsflash. We all loved her too. You're not the only one who's grieving." Her words felt like a slap. I wanted to shout, to defend myself, to tell her that she couldn't possibly understand what that locket meant to me. But instead, I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor in the sudden silence. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. "Maybe I am being selfish. But I'm okay with that." With that, I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving the table behind, feeling the weight of their judgment follow me as I went. I could hear the murmurs and the quiet remarks, the not-so-subtle whispers of disapproval. But as I walked away, clutching the locket that hung around my neck, I knew that I'd made my choice. I'd chosen to honor the memory of the woman who had meant the world to me, even if it cost me the acceptance of my family. Thanksgiving that year became a turning point. It was the moment I realized that family loyalty didn't always mean yielding to everyone's demands. That sometimes it meant standing alone, even when it was painful. I hadn't expected the cost to be so high. But as I looked down at the locket resting against my chest, I knew that, despite the pain, I had no regrets. After Thanksgiving, the silence from my family was almost deafening. Where before I'd received texts and calls from my cousins and aunts. Now I only had messages from my parents or, on rare occasions, Mark. It was as though the family collectively decided to put me on pause, waiting for me to come to my senses. I wouldn't be guilted into sharing the locket or pretending this was a trivial matter. Despite the chill, I stayed in touch with Mark, who kept trying to mediate from the sidelines. He reached out regularly, trying to encourage me to see Tina's perspective. But I could tell his own patience was thinning. It was clear he was under pressure from Tina and, no doubt, was enduring his own share of stress from our family. One night, Mark called. There was an urgency in his voice I hadn't heard before, as if he were teetering on the edge of frustration and resignation. He didn't waste time with small talk and launched straight into it. You know, everyone's still pretty upset, right? Especially Tina. She feels like you're undermining her place in the family, he said, his voice low but tense. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my tone steady. I get that, Mark, but I've already explained my reasons to her, more times than I should have had to. He sighed, clearly exasperated. Yeah, I know, but you're drawing a hard line here, and it's making everyone feel uncomfortable. Would it really be so bad to just let her have it for a while? The words struck a nerve. I knew he was just trying to make peace, but it hurt that he was even asking. Mark, this isn't a toy to be passed around. This is something Grandma left me. Not the entire family. She gave it to me specifically. Why isn't that enough for everyone to understand? Maybe because to everyone else, it seems like you're making this about you. Like you're holding onto it just to have power over everyone. The comment stung. I hadn't thought of it like that. But it was clear that's how they saw it, an exercise in control, rather than a matter of honoring Grandma's wishes. After a few moments of silence, I finally spoke. I'm not keeping it to be selfish. I'm keeping it because it's a part of Grandma. It's the closest thing I have to the memories we shared, to the stories she told me, to the love she showed me. My voice cracked despite my best efforts, and I paused, collecting myself. I'm sorry if everyone feels slighted by it, but this isn't something I'm willing to share. Mark sighed, a mix of resignation and understanding settling into his tone. I get it, I really do, but you're going to have to deal with the fact that it's going to keep things tense. People are going to feel slighted, maybe for a long time. I know, I said quietly, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a heavy blanket. But the reality was that I'd already decided that the cost of keeping the locket was one I was willing to pay. For a few weeks, I waited for the dust to settle, hoping that time would ease some of the tension. But with each passing day, the silence from my family grew heavier, a tangible reminder of the rift that had formed. Friends started to fill the space where family had once been, and I realized how isolated I'd become. It wasn't that I wanted to distance myself from my family, I missed them. And part of me wanted to fix it all. But I knew that mending things would mean giving in. And I wasn't willing to let go of the locket. Then, around Christmas, I received a letter in the mail. I recognized Tina's handwriting on the envelope. And my heart sank. I wasn't sure I was ready to open it. But I forced myself to read her words, bracing for whatever accusations or pleas she had in store. The letter was long and emotional, filled with Tina's frustration and hurt. She explained that her claim to the locket was more than just about family, it was about feeling accepted and included. About wanting to be seen as a true member of our family and not an outsider. She described how she'd hoped the locket would be a symbol of that acceptance. A way for her to feel connected to Grandma's memory, even though she'd come into the family later. She ended by admitting that, while she was hurt, she would respect my decision. But she hoped I understood the impact it had on her. I sat with the letter for a long time, letting her words sink in. For the first time, I saw her perspective more clearly. It wasn't just about a piece of jewelry, it was about belonging. About wanting to feel included and valued in our family. I still didn't agree with her sense of entitlement, but I began to understand why she'd reacted so strongly. I wrote her back, explaining my side once again, but this time with a gentler tone. letting her know I valued her place in the family and that my decision wasn't meant to exclude her. I wanted her to understand that the locket was more than just a family heirloom to me. It was a deeply personal piece of my relationship with Grandma. After that, I felt a small weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't changed my mind, but I hoped I'd taken a step toward mending the fracture between us. It took months for things to calm down, but gradually, the distance between me and my family lessened. My cousins began reaching out again, and while Tina and I still had an awkward tension between us, the open hostility faded. She seemed to accept, albeit reluctantly, that I wouldn't be handing over the locket. Now, looking back, I still feel the sadness that came from the rift the locket created. But I don't regret my decision. I had to stand up for what I believed was right, even if it meant losing some peace within my family. The locket still sits in its place in my room, a silent testament to my connection with Grandma and the strength I found to hold on to something that mattered deeply to me. Sometimes, loving family means protecting memories, even if others don't understand. And while the wounds might take time to heal, I know I honored Grandma's wishes, just as she would have wanted. And in the end, that's all that really mattered.